You know, in all my years in the Oval Office, nothing ever concentrated the mind quite like a threat you could almost see from your own coastline. And I need you to sit with something for a moment, because the distance we're talking about tonight is 90 miles. That's it. 90 miles between Cuba and the state of Florida. Now look, as of this week, U.S. intelligence confirms that roughly 300 Iranian Shahed 136 kamikaze drones are sitting on that island. Each one carries over 100 pounds of explosives, flies over 1,000 miles, and costs less than a used car to build. Miami, Tampa, Tallahassee, even Atlanta, all within range. And we'll come back to what that means in a moment. But here's the honest truth. And I want to be careful how I say this, because this is not a partisan observation. This is an American one. The chain of decisions that brought us to this exact point, from the strike that killed Ayatollah Khomeini in February, to the ceasefire that collapsed this week, to a president declaring 1,000 missiles locked and loaded on social media at midnight, that chain matters. Every link in it matters, because how a nation responds to danger tells you everything about whether its institutions are holding or whether they're being held hostage to impulse. And that, my friends, that's what I want to walk through with you tonight. Now, to understand what we're looking at, you've got to go back a bit. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel carried out joint strikes on Tehran that killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran for over 3 decades. I want you to think about that for a second. A sitting head of state assassinated. That changed everything. It unleashed a full-scale war, closed the Strait of Hormuz, sent oil prices through the roof, and plunged the region into the worst crisis since the Gulf War. By April, both sides were exhausted enough to agree to a ceasefire. By June 17th, they signed a memorandum of understanding at Versailles, 60 days to negotiate a nuclear deal. And for about 3 weeks, there was a fragile, imperfect calm. But here's where the Cuba piece comes in, and it matters enormously. Those Shahed drones didn't arrive last week. According to Axios, they'd been transferred from Iran and Russia to Cuba over a period of years, going back to at least 2023. I know something about Cuba policy. I dealt with the 1994 refugee crisis, the Helms-Burton Act, the constant tension of having a hostile government 90 miles from Key West. And I'll tell you, the slow, quiet transfer of 300 attack drones to that island should have set off every alarm in Washington long before now. And that's a failure that belongs to more than one administration. Let me tell you something. When Jeb Bush stood up at the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables on July 8th, next to a recovered Shahed 136 drone, that was a visual I don't think any of us should forget. This is the weapon that weighs over 100 pounds in explosives, flies at 115 miles an hour, travels over 1,000 miles, and costs less than a used car to manufacture. It is, as Congressman Carlos Jimenez said that day, the face of modern warfare. Now, Jeb praised the president. He said, and I'll give him his exact words, "We have decimated Iran's capability to make mischief in the region." And I'm not going to dismiss that. The strikes on Iran's drone production infrastructure were militarily significant. That's a fact. But here's what we've got to be honest about. Those 300 drones in Cuba were transferred before this conflict even began. The military campaign in the Middle East didn't prevent this particular threat from landing in our hemisphere. That distinction matters. Ambassador Waltz went to the UN on July 7th and called Cuba a national security threat, citing Chinese and Russian intelligence posts still operating on the island. And he's not wrong about that either. Those facilities have been there for years under multiple administrations. So when we talk about who let this happen, the honest answer is we all had a hand in it. Now look, this is where I need to speak carefully because I'm going to be critical, but I want to be fair. The decision to strike Khamenei in February was the single most consequential foreign policy choice any president has made since the Iraq invasion. I ordered strikes myself. Operation Desert Fox in 1998, Kosovo in 99. And I will tell you, every one of those decisions costs you sleep and carries consequences you can't fully predict. So I understand the weight. But here's the honest truth. The way you communicate during a crisis is not decoration, it is policy. When the president posts on Truth Social at midnight that 1,000 missiles are locked and loaded aimed at Iran, when he says he'll completely decimate and destroy all areas of the country and signs it, "Praise be to Allah," that is not deterrence. That is provocation dressed up as strength. And when he tells reporters, "I'm their number one target," and leaves instructions to bomb them at levels they've never seen if something happens to him, I understand the threat is real. Israeli intelligence confirmed a specific new assassination plot this week. But a president framing a national security crisis around his personal survival changes the entire dynamic. It makes diplomacy harder, it inflames the other side, and it turns a geopolitical confrontation into a personal vendetta. That's not how institutions are supposed to work. We've got to remember something fundamental about this country. We built a system of checks and balances precisely for moments like this, when emotions are high, when the threats are real, and when the temptation to act on impulse is at its strongest. That's when the system is supposed to hold. And right now, I'm not sure it is. The ceasefire didn't collapse through a formal National Security Council process. It collapsed because the president declared it over on July 7th at a NATO press conference in Ankara. Within hours, we were striking 80-plus targets. By July 12th, that number was 140. All while the 60-day window of the Versailles Memorandum was still open. Congress passed a war powers resolution, both chambers, including Republican votes, and the president called it poorly timed and meaningless. The Secret Service had to switch him from the new Qatar-gifted Air Force One to the older plane mid-trip because it lacked missile defenses. Our Gulf allies, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, are getting hit by Iranian retaliatory strikes while simultaneously trying to mediate peace talks. And here's what I notice. Even Jeb Bush, while praising the military campaign, pivoted immediately to the Cuba drone threat. That's a Republican signaling in his own careful way that bravado alone isn't enough. When even your allies are trying to redirect the conversation toward unfinished business, that tells you something about the state of the strategy. Now, I spent my whole career reading the politics underneath the policy. And I want to be transparent with you about what I see here. Jeb Bush, the man Donald Trump humiliated in the 2016 primaries, called low energy, mocked on national television, stood before cameras this week and praised this president's Iran campaign. That's not nothing. That's a significant political gesture. But notice what Bush actually did. He praised the military action, then immediately raised the alarm about 300 drones in Cuba. He was saying two things at once. Credit where it's earned, but this threat exists on your watch, or at least wasn't neutralized on it. That's sophisticated political communication. Ambassador Waltz, meanwhile, used Cuba as both a genuine security concern and a political frame. Communism, hemisphere, Florida voters, the whole architecture of a midterm argument. And the assassination threats against the president are being deployed the same way. They are absolutely real. And they are also being packaged as a narrative that casts him as a wartime leader under personal fire. I say this without cynicism. Democratic accountability requires us to see both the genuine danger and the political architecture being built around it. Because when a nation can't distinguish between a security response and a political performance, it loses the ability to evaluate either one honestly. Let me be honest with you about what I think happens next. And I'll give you several possibilities, because the truth is, nobody knows for sure. First, there's still a narrow path to diplomacy. Pakistan and Qatar have been mediating. Oman drafted a proposal to manage Strait of Hormuz traffic, and technical talks were reportedly ongoing, even as strikes were landing. The 60-day window from the Versailles deal hasn't fully closed. But after 140 targets hit on July 12th, after Iran closed the strait again, that path is getting narrower by the hour. Second, escalation. Iran retaliates asymmetrically through proxies, through the assassination plots, or possibly by activating the Cuba drone capability. 300 Shaheeds pointed at Florida is not a theoretical concern anymore. It's a homeland security variable we haven't faced since October 1962. And I draw that comparison carefully but deliberately. Third, regional contagion. Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Jordan, they're all taking fire now. Gulf state oil infrastructure is being hit. Global energy markets are already shaking. A wider conflagration pulls in actors and consequences none of us can fully predict. Fourth, and this is what I'd work toward, a back-channel off-ramp, probably through new intermediaries, possibly involving parties we haven't heard from yet. Every war I've studied eventually finds the negotiating table. The question is, how much damage gets done first? You know, I've lived long enough and served long enough to know that America always faces these crossroads. We faced it during the missile crisis. We faced it after September 11th. We're facing it now. And the question is never really about the threat. The threats are always real. The question is about us, about what kind of country we choose to be and the response. A republic, and I mean this with everything I have, a republic is only as strong as its capacity to deliberate, to debate, and to decide together. not to be governed by a social media post at midnight, not to have foreign policy reduced to personal grievance, and not to abandon diplomacy because it's harder than dropping ordnance. I worked across the aisle with Newt Gingrich. We balanced budgets together. We didn't agree on much, but we agreed that the process mattered, that institutions mattered, that the country was bigger than any one of us. The drones in Cuba are real. The assassination threats are real. The Strait of Hormuz is in crisis. These are exactly the moments that require America at its most disciplined, most united, most institutionally sound. And I will tell you, the American people have always been smarter and braver than their worst moments. I still believe that. And I think if we're honest with ourselves tonight, most of us still do.